The lantern was still warm when Benjamin Archer rode up to Etta Abbott's gate on that sharp October morning in 1882. The Wyoming sky stretched wide and pale as bleached bone above the Laramie plains, and the moment he saw the broken fence sagging against the earth like a tired old man, something shifted in his chest that he could not immediately name. He had borrowed the lantern 3 weeks prior from Etta's late husband's ranch hand, old Clem Dawes, who had since moved on to work cattle in Montana, leaving the lantern in Benjamin's care with the casual instruction that it belonged to the Abbott place and ought to be returned whenever the man got around to it. Benjamin had gotten around to it this morning, partly because he had nothing pressing and partly because guilt had been scratching at the back of his skull the way a branch scratches at a window in the wind. He was a man who paid his debts, returned what he borrowed, and did not let obligations linger like unwashed dishes. What he had not anticipated was the state of the Abbott property, and what he had not anticipated even more was Etta Abbott herself. She was standing in the yard with a hammer in her hand, her dark hair twisted back in a braid that had mostly escaped its pins, trying to drive a stake into the hard autumn ground with a fury that suggested the ground had personally offended her. She was 26 years old, tall for a woman of that era, with strong, capable hands and dark eyes that caught the morning light the way still water catches a reflection, perfectly and without apology. She wore a faded blue work dress and mud on her boots, and she was losing her battle with the frozen earth spectacularly. Benjamin pulled his horse, a big roan named Colonel, to a stop at what remained of the gate, which was to say the posts were still standing, but the crossbeams had come away entirely and were lying in the dirt like fallen soldiers. He sat in the saddle for a moment, the lantern hanging from his saddle horn, watching her work with a mixture of admiration and something close to pain, because the fence was not going to cooperate with her, not at that angle, not with that stake, and not with the ground as cold and resistant as it was. "Mrs. Abbott," he called out, removing his hat. She looked up, and the expression on her face cycled rapidly through surprise, recognition, wariness, and finally, a guarded sort of neutrality that told him she was a woman who had learned to manage what her face showed to the world. He had seen her twice before in passing, once at the general store in Laramie, and once at the church social in late August, but they had never spoken more than the brief pleasantries that frontier life demanded. "Mr. Archer," she said, and then looked at the lantern on his saddle horn with a flicker of something like recognition. "You found it." "I borrowed it," he corrected gently, swinging down from Colonel with the ease of a man who had been climbing on and off horses his entire life. "From Clem, before he headed north. He said it was yours." "It was my husband's," she said, and the way she said it was neither grieving nor dismissive but simply factual, the way a woman 3 years widowed refers to things that used to belong to someone who is no longer present. Thomas Abbott had died of a fever in the spring of 1879, leaving Etta with 140 acres, a house that needed work, a small herd of cattle, and a stubbornness that had kept her going when lesser women might have packed up and moved back east to their families. Benjamin knew most of this from town talk, not from anything she had told him. He walked through the gap where the gate should have been and held the lantern out to her. She set down her hammer and took it, and her fingers brushed his briefly on the handle, and neither of them remarked upon it. "Thank you," she said, studying the lantern as if it held some memory she was deciding whether or not to revisit. Then she set it on the porch railing and picked the hammer back up, returning to her losing argument with the earth. Benjamin stood there for a moment, Colonel's reins loose in his hand, looking at the fence. The damage was substantial. At least 40 feet of the south-facing run had given way entirely, the rotted posts having simply surrendered to time and a recent run of hard rain followed by the first freeze. Without a fence along that side, her cattle could wander into the open range and mingle with other herds or, worse, drift toward the road and cause accidents or be claimed by unscrupulous men who played loose with brands. He should have said good day and ridden on. He had returned the lantern. His obligation was met. He was a free man with a small ranch of his own about 4 miles east, and he had a water trough to repair and a barn door that had been hanging crooked for a week. Instead, he heard himself say, "That stake's going in at the wrong angle. You need to drive it straight down first and then work it toward the fence line once it's seated." She stopped hammering and looked at him with an expression that walked a very fine line between irritation and reluctant interest. "Is that right?" she said. "Ground's frozen in the top layer," he said. "About 3 inches down it loosens up some. If you drive it straight first you can break through the frost and then adjust." She looked at the stake, looked at him, and then held the hammer out with a gesture that was simultaneously an invitation and a challenge. He had the distinct sense that she was testing something, though he could not have said precisely what. He tied Colonel to the standing gate post and took the hammer. It took him 4 solid strikes to seat the stake properly, and she watched with her arms crossed and her head tilted, and he could feel her eyes on him the way you feel the sun on the back of your neck, warm and impossible to ignore. When the stake was seated, he straightened and handed her the hammer back. "There," he said. She walked over and tested the stake with both hands, leaning her weight against it, and it held. She made a small sound that might have been approval or might have been merely acknowledgement, and then she looked at the rest of the fence line with an expression he recognized, because he had worn it himself, that particular combination of exhaustion and determination that frontier people developed like a callus. "The posts need replacing on the whole south run," she said. "I have the lumber. I just don't have the extra hands. My hired man, Pete Garza, he broke his wrist 2 weeks ago and he's still not fit enough to swing a hammer." Benjamin looked at the fence. He looked at his horse. He thought about the barn door and the water trough. "I've got nothing that can't wait until tomorrow," he said, which was almost true. "If you've got the lumber and the hardware, I can set the new posts today. It'll go faster with 2 people anyway, one to hold and one to drive." She looked at him for a long moment, and he got the feeling she was weighing him, not just his offer but the entirety of him, his character and his intentions and his reliability, with the efficiency of a woman who had learned that every person who came onto her land either made her life easier or harder, and she had gotten good at telling the difference early. "I'll make coffee," she said finally. "And I expect you to eat lunch, because I'm not having a man work half the day on my property and ride away hungry. That's not how things are done." "No, ma'am," he agreed, and felt something in his chest unknot itself. They started on the fence an hour later, after coffee that was strong enough to strip paint and a brief planning session in which she showed him the lumber she had stacked behind the barn, and he mentally calculated what they could accomplish before dark. She was not a woman who hovered or supervised unnecessarily. She worked alongside him with competence and without complaint, holding posts steady while he drove them, passing nails with accuracy, and taking her turn with the hammer in a way that told him she had been doing physical work her whole life. The morning passed in a rhythm that was almost pleasant, the sound of hammering and the occasional instruction, the cool autumn air sharpening as the sun climbed, Colonel grazing peacefully in the yard where Etta had tied him to a better post. Benjamin found himself talking more than he usually did with people he did not know well. She had a way of listening that made you want to fill the silence, not because she was performing interest but because she was genuinely present, and it was unsettling and comfortable at the same time. He told her about his ranch, the small herd of cattle he kept, the quarter horses he was developing a reputation for breeding. She told him about the challenges of running the Abbott place alone, the difficulties of being a woman who owned land in a territory where men tended to view female landowners as either temporarily inconvenient or permanently available, and neither interpretation was accurate in her case. "3 different men have offered to buy me out in the last 2 years," she said, driving a nail with a precision that suggested she was putting some feeling into it. "2 of them were decent about it. One of them seemed to think that persistence would eventually wear me down." "Did it?" Benjamin asked. She gave him a look that could have felled a lesser man. "What do you think?" "I think you're still here," he said. "I'm still here," she agreed, and the way she said it was like a declaration and a warning and a small private satisfaction all rolled together. By noon, they had set 6 new posts and Benjamin's shoulders were aching pleasantly, the good kind of ache that comes from honest work. She called him in for lunch and they sat at her kitchen table with plates of cold beef and fresh bread and the remainder of the morning's coffee, and Benjamin noticed that the kitchen was immaculate and spare, and had the quality of a space that had been organized by someone who understood that order was a form of survival. There was a shelf of books along one wall, more books than he would have expected, and he commented on them. "My mother was a teacher," Etta said. "She believed reading was as necessary as eating. She sent me books every Christmas until she passed, and I've kept the habit." "What do you read?" he asked. "Whatever I can get from the lending library in Laramie." "History mostly, some fiction. There's a woman there, Mrs. Havorson, who orders things from back east for me when I ask." She studied him over her coffee cup. "Do you read?" "I do," he said. "Not as much as I should. My father was a reader. He left me a box of books when he died and I've been working through them slowly. Right now I'm on a history of the Mexican War." She nodded. "My husband fought in it. Well, not the Mexican War. The war between the states. He was at Gettysburg." She said this the same way she said most things about her late husband, with a kind of careful distance that was not coldness, but rather the learned equilibrium of a woman who had processed her grief and integrated it. Benjamin had been at Gettysburg too, or near it, but he had been a child then, 10 years old in 1863, and the knowledge of that battle had come to him through newspaper accounts and the stories of older men. He mentioned this and she smiled, and it was the first real smile she had given him, not the polite, controlled expressions of earlier but something genuine and unguarded, and it changed her face in a way that made him set down his fork because he needed a second to recalibrate. He was 29 years old. He had never been married, had never been particularly close to it, had conducted himself as a man who believed love was a thing that happened to other people more naturally than it happened to him. He had been wrong before in this belief, and he was being shown that he was wrong again now, though he was not yet willing to call what he was feeling by its right name. They went back to the fence after lunch. The afternoon stretched long and golden the way Wyoming October afternoons do, the light going amber and warm before it fades, and they worked their way along the south run steadily, and the conversation continued in that easy, intermittent way of people who are doing something together with their hands, dropping in and out of talk as naturally as breathing. He learned that she had 2 younger brothers back in Illinois who wanted her to come home, that she had a small kitchen garden that she was fiercely proud of, that she could rope a calf faster than most men, and had once, in necessity, delivered a breech foal alone at 2 in the morning. She learned that he had come to Wyoming from Tennessee 4 years ago, that he had tried gold country first and found it not to his liking, that he had a dog named Hector who was the most opinionated animal he had ever encountered, that he had not been to church since the previous Christmas because Sunday mornings were his one reliable time for quiet. "That's honest at least," she said. "I try to be," he said. "Most men who want something from a woman tell her what she wants to hear," she said, and it came out matter of fact, not accusatory, just a statement of observed reality from a woman who had been navigating the particular social geography of being an eligible widow on the frontier. "I don't want anything from you," he said, and then paused because that had come out slightly wrong. "I mean to say I came to return a lantern. I stayed to help with the fence because the fence needed helping. That's all there is to it." She was quiet for a moment, holding a post steady while he hammered the crossbeam into place, and he could not see her face from the angle he was working. "That's a simple explanation," she said. "I'm a fairly simple man." "No," she said, "you are not." He did not know how to respond to that, so he drove in another nail and let the sound of the hammer fill the space where a response might have gone. By 4 in the afternoon they had completed 2/3 of the south run. The light was beginning to tilt, and he knew he should ride back before dark because the road had one particularly bad stretch where the ground was undermined by a buried creek, and his horse could break a leg at night if he did not know where to step. "I'll come back Saturday," he said. "Finish the last of the south run. It shouldn't take more than a few hours with 2 people." She looked at him with that weighing expression again and then gave a small nod. "Saturday then," she said. "Come in the morning if you're able." He rode home in the amber afternoon, the roan moving in a steady, comfortable jog, and he thought about Etta Abbott for most of the 4 miles. He thought about her hands on the fence post and her voice when she talked about her books, and the way she had looked standing in the yard with her hammer like she was the last defender of something worth defending, which he supposed she was. He thought about the smile, the real one, and how it had landed on him like a stone dropped in still water. And he was a man who had never before used a metaphor like that about another human being, and he recognized that this was significant. He arrived home to find Hector waiting on the porch with the air of a dog who had opinions about the hour. "I know," Benjamin told him. Hector expressed further opinions. "I helped with a fence," Benjamin said, unsaddling Colonel, "and I'm going back Saturday." Hector appeared to consider this and offer a qualified endorsement. Benjamin cooked himself supper and sat on the porch in the early dark and thought about October in Wyoming, and the way the wind moves through the dry grass like something alive. And he thought about Etta Abbott's face and her books and her stubbornness and her refusal to be worn down. And he went to bed knowing that something had changed today, even if he was not entirely sure of the shape of it yet. Saturday came with the first serious cold front of the season, a northwest wind pushing clouds in low and fast, and Benjamin packed his tools and a length of extra rope and an old barn coat, and rode the 4 miles to the Abbott place with his hat pulled down and his collar up. And he was thinking about whether she would have coffee ready, and he was thinking about her before he had fully acknowledged to himself that he was thinking about her. She had coffee ready. She also had a plate of biscuits and an expression that suggested she was mildly surprised he had actually come, which she was trying to conceal and not entirely succeeding. "The weather turned," she said. "It did," he agreed. "But the post'll go in the same whether it's warm or cold. Might as well finish it." They drank coffee at the kitchen table, and the warmth of the room was against the window where the wind was pressing, and it was very domestic and quiet, and Benjamin was aware of being in someone else's home in a way that was not uncomfortable, but rather the opposite, which was more alarming than discomfort would have been. She asked about his quarter-horse operation, and he told her more than he had on Wednesday, about the particular bloodlines he was working with, about a young stallion he was considering purchasing from a rancher in Colorado, about his plans to expand the breeding program over the next several years. She listened with the focused attention. She gave everything and asked questions that showed she understood both horses and business, which he supposed he should have expected. Thomas had plans to breed horses too, she said, and the past tense sat quietly between them. He never got the chance to do much about it. "I'm sorry," Benjamin said. 3 years is enough time to stop being devastated, she said, with what he suspected was as much candor as she usually offered anyone. "I miss him the way you miss someone who was part of the fabric of your life, but I'm not grieving anymore. I've had people act as though I'm supposed to stay in mourning forever, as though a woman who isn't actively weeping over her dead husband must not have loved him properly." Benjamin thought about this. "Did you love him?" he asked, and then immediately wondered if he had overstepped. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I did. We were suited to each other. We wanted the same things and we worked well together, and there was real affection between us. I was 23 and he was 31 when we married." She paused. "I know what people must think, that I loved the land and was using him for it, but that's not what happened." "I didn't think it," he said. "I know," she said. "You're one of the few who wouldn't." He was not sure how she knew that about him, but he was not going to question it. They finished the fence that morning, driving the last post just before noon with the wind cutting in earnest around them, and Etta's braid whipping sideways, and her cheeks gone bright from the cold. When the last crossbeam was hammered into place, she stepped back and looked at the whole south run with her hands on her hips, and something in her face that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, but some combination of both and more. "Thank you," she said. Not the polite automatic thank you of Wednesday, but something slower and more deliberate, like she was really saying it. "I would have managed eventually, but it would have been a long time coming." "I know," he said. "You always could have just dropped off the lantern and ridden on." "I could have," he agreed. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her and he thought about saying something simple and let himself off the hook with a half answer. But she had been honest with him about her husband and her grief and the men who underestimated her, and he felt he owed her the same currency. "Because the fence needed doing," he said, "and you were the one trying to do it alone, and that didn't seem right to me." She looked at him for a moment, and then something in her face shifted, not the full smile of that first day, but something quieter and perhaps more meaningful, a lessening of the careful neutrality she kept in place like a well-maintained fence of her own. "Eat lunch before you go," she said. He ate lunch. He ate it slowly, if he was being honest with himself, because he was not particularly eager to ride back into the cold, and he was even less eager to leave. She told him about her kitchen garden, which she had put to bed for winter, but was planning to expand in the spring. She wanted to try growing more root vegetables, and perhaps some herbs if she could manage it, and she had ordered seeds from a catalog out of Illinois. She talked about the garden with the same focused pleasure she brought to everything, and he found himself genuinely interested, not performing interest to be polite but actually interested, which surprised him because he had never before particularly cared about kitchen gardens. "I could bring you some seedlings in the spring," he said. "I've got a woman at the next ranch over, Mrs. Thorne. She starts things early and always has more than she needs. She'd be glad to let you have some starts." Etta looked at him with faint amusement. "You're already planning for spring." "I'm a practical man," he said. "You keep saying things like that." "Like what?" "Practical, simple, straightforward. As though you're trying to convince me of something." He sat back and studied her. "What do you think I'm actually like?" She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "I think you're a man who pays attention to details that other people walk past," she said. "I think you have strong opinions that you keep mostly to yourself. I think you came back on Saturday not because the fence needed finishing, but because you wanted to come back." The directness of this stunned him momentarily into silence. She did not look away. "You might be right about that last part," he said. "I usually am," she said, and there was warmth in it, a very dry warmth, like sunlight through heavy glass. He rode home in the cold and thought about spring and about seedlings, and about the way she said things directly, without decoration, and how unusual and how deeply appealing that was in a world full of people who circled around what they meant. Over the following weeks he found reasons, not manufactured but real and legitimate reasons, to pass by the Abbott place. He brought her a load of firewood in November, because he had more than he needed from a recent cutting, and she would need it with winter coming on. She paid him for the wood in a matter-of-fact way that told him she would not accept charity, and he respected that. He stayed for coffee both times he delivered. In November she came to his ranch too, which he had not anticipated. She had a heifer who was showing signs of a respiratory illness, and she had heard from Mrs. Thorne that Benjamin had dealt with the same thing in his herd the previous winter, and had found a treatment that worked. She arrived on a gray mare named Duchess, practical and direct, and asking specifically about the treatment and nothing more. He told her everything he knew and walked out to look at the heifer with her and helped her draft a letter to the veterinarian in Laramie. She stayed for coffee that time too, in his kitchen, which was less ordered than hers but had the same quality of a space that was used and inhabited rather than performed. She studied his bookshelf with the focused attention she gave to everything. "You weren't exaggerating about the books," she said. "I generally don't exaggerate," he said. "The Mexican War History," she said, pulling a volume out. "My father had this one. He was in Mexico himself briefly before I was born." She paged through it briefly and then slid it back into place. "Could I borrow it when you finished?" "I finished it 2 weeks ago," he said, and pulled it out and held it out to her. She took it. Again their fingers met briefly on the cover. "I'll return it," she said. "I know you will," he said. She returned it in December, on a Sunday afternoon when the first real snow of the season was coming down, and the world was going quietly white, and she rode up on Duchess looking like something from a painting, her dark coat against the snow and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She had a bag with her, and in it was the book, and also a jar of apple preserves she had put up in October. "You didn't have to bring anything," he said. "I know I didn't," she said, which was not the same thing as saying she didn't want to. They sat by his fire and talked for 2 hours, and it was the best Sunday afternoon he had spent in a very long time, possibly ever. She had opinions about the Mexican War history that were incisive and well-considered and occasionally challenged assumptions he had not realized he was making, and he pushed back on some of her points, and she pushed back on his pushback, and it was exhilarating in the particular way that only comes from being truly matched by another mind. He wanted to tell her she was remarkable. He was aware that this was probably too soon and possibly inappropriate and definitely nerve-wracking. He said instead, "You should come for dinner sometime." She looked at him over the fire. "That's a different kind of invitation than wood and medical advice," she said. "I'm aware of that," he said. She was quiet for a moment that lasted approximately 1 geological age. "Next Sunday," she said, "if you're a decent cook." "I'm a passable cook," he said honestly. "That'll do," she said. She came the following Sunday, and he made a beef stew that was better than passable if he was honest, and they ate by the fire while the snow fell outside and Hector lay at their feet with the proprietary ease of a dog who felt the situation had been correctly resolved. She fed Hector a bit of bread, and he transferred his devotion to her immediately and without shame. "Traitor," Benjamin told him. "He's sensible," Etta said. After dinner they sat by the fire, and she read aloud from a collection of poetry she had brought, because she had been reading it on the way over and didn't want to stop, which was such a perfectly Etta Abbott thing to do that he found himself charmed to the point of discomfort. Her reading voice was low and clear, and she read well, with the attention to rhythm of someone who had been reading poetry since childhood. He sat across from her and watched her read and felt the weight and inevitability of what was happening to him, and he thought he should probably say something about it at some point, and wondered how a man did that with a woman like her, a woman who saw through things, who noticed the difference between what you said and what you meant. When she finished reading, she looked up and caught him watching her, and she held his gaze for a moment that was very still, like the moment before the wind shifts. "Benjamin," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name without the Mr. "Etta," he said. "What are we doing?" she said. It was a straightforward question without performance or coyness, just the directness that was her nature applied to a subject that most people danced around for months. "I think we're becoming something," he said. "I'm not in the habit of naming things before I'm sure of them, but I'm fairly sure of this." She looked at him steadily. "I am not easy to be with," she said. "I have opinions about everything and I don't hold them quietly. I've been told I'm too independent for a woman and too stubborn for a wife." "Who told you that?" "Various people. The man who was too persistent about buying my land said the stubborn part. My mother said the independent part, though lovingly." "Those sound like qualities to me," Benjamin said. "They sound like warnings," she said. "I've been warned," he said. She was quiet again, and in the quiet the fire snapped and Hector resettled himself, and outside the snow continued its steady work on the world. "I like you," she said, "more than I expected to. I'm telling you that because I think you should know it and because I'm not good at pretending things are less than they are." He felt the words land in him the way real things land, with weight and warmth. "I like you too," he said, "considerably." She smiled then, that real smile, and he thought that he would do a great many things to have her smile at him like that on a regular basis. which was not a thought he had ever had about anyone before, and which told him everything he needed to know about where he stood. December deepened into winter, and they saw each other regularly, at his place and at hers, sometimes at church and at the Mercantile in Laramie, and people noticed, the way people in small communities always notice these things, with varying levels of approval and commentary. Mrs. Thorne approved enthusiastically and made no secret of it. Mr. Dalt, who owned the hardware store and had had his own designs on the Abbott property, did not approve and also made no secret of it. Most people held a position somewhere in the reasonable middle and expressed it through the currency of raised eyebrows and knowing nods. Etta's hired man, Pete Garza, whose wrist was mending well by December, observed the situation with the philosophical equanimity of a man who had worked for Etta Abbott for 2 years and had a deep respect for her judgment. He told Benjamin privately, while they were working on the cattle loading chute one afternoon in late December, "She doesn't do anything halfway, Mr. Archer. If she's decided you're worth the trouble, that means something, because she is very particular about what's worth the trouble." "I'm aware of that," Benjamin said. "Good," Pete said, and returned to the chute, and that was the entirety of the conversation, which was enough. On Christmas Eve, which fell on a Sunday, Benjamin rode to the Abbott place with a wrapped package tied to his saddle, a collection of essays on natural history that he had ordered from a bookseller in Chicago 3 months ago, before he had fully admitted to himself what he was doing, which meant some part of him had been very certain for a long time. Etta met him at the gate, which was fully operational now, the new wood still pale against the older posts, and she was wearing a green wool dress he had not seen before, and her hair was up properly, and she looked beautiful in a way that was not decorative but essential, like water or good ground. She had a package for him, too. Inside it was a pair of fine leather riding gloves, the expensive kind from the tanner in Laramie, and they fit perfectly, which meant she had measured him at some point without his noticing. "When did you measure my hands?" he asked. "3 weeks ago when you were looking at the horse," she said, without particular embarrassment. They ate Christmas Eve dinner at her table, and she had cooked a proper meal, roasted chicken and sweet potatoes, and a pie that was beyond his ability to do justice to with words, and they sat afterward by the fire in her front room and talked until the fire burned low, and somewhere in the course of that evening, the remaining space between them closed in the way that these things happen, not dramatically, but inevitably, like weather moving in from a direction you have been watching for a while. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, and she let him, and she turned her hand over so their fingers were linked, and they sat like that for a long time looking at the fire, and it was one of the best hours of Benjamin Archer's life. "I have to say something," he said eventually. "Then say it," she said. "I came to your gate in October to return a lantern," he said. "And I don't know if that was luck or providence or just a fence that needed fixing, but I am glad I came. I'm glad every morning I wake up that I came." She was quiet for a moment. "Benjamin," she said, "I have been alone for 3 years, not unhappily exactly, but alone. And I had gotten very accustomed to alone. I had made my peace with it." A pause. "You have disturbed my peace considerably." "Is that a complaint?" he asked. "No," she said. "It isn't." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth briefly to the back of it, the formal gesture of an era that encoded feeling in small, precise movements, and he felt her fingers tighten around his. They were, by January, firmly an acknowledged pair in the way that frontier communities acknowledge such things, with the practical expectation that the logical conclusion was coming, and the informal social machinery that adjusted around couples before they had formally declared themselves. Mrs. Thorne began making pointed remarks about her spare bedroom being no use to anyone. The Reverend Mr. Calder began greeting Benjamin with the particularly approving warmth he reserved for men he expected to be making use of his services soon. Benjamin was aware of all of this, and was not bothered by any of it, partly because his intentions were exactly what everyone suspected, and partly because he had never been much influenced by what people expected of him. What concerned him more was Etta herself. She was not a woman who could be rushed or pushed toward anything. She had made her own choices her entire life, and she would make this one on her own terms and in her own time, and he respected that absolutely. But he also knew what he wanted, and he was not a man who left things unnamed forever. On a cold January Saturday he took her riding, which she loved, both of them on horses that were working horses and not show pieces, and covering the frozen ground between their properties with ease, the Wyoming plain spreading around them in shades of white and gray-brown, the mountains blue in the far distance. They rode for 2 hours, talking intermittently, mostly comfortable in the silence, their breath and the horse's breath making clouds in the air. They stopped on a rise that looked out over both their properties, his to the east and hers to the west, and the wind was still for once and the afternoon light was crystalline and particular. "I want to marry you," he said. Not as a question, but he said it like a question, looking at her because it was her answer that mattered. She looked at the view for a moment. She looked at him. "I want that too," she said. He had been prepared for more deliberation, more of the careful weighing he had come to associate with her. The straightforwardness of it landed on him like unexpected warmth. "Just like that," he said. "I've had 4 months to think about it," she said. "It's not like that at all. I have been very thorough." He laughed, which was not the response he had imagined himself having in the moment of accepting a proposal, but she smiled and he thought it was the best possible response to the best possible moment. "There are things I need you to understand," she said. "This ranch is mine. I'm not giving it up. I'm not merging it into yours in some legal arrangement that gives you control of everything I've built. If we marry, we're partners, truly. Not in the way people say it and mean something else. I know that," he said. "I wouldn't have it any other way. I mean it, Benjamin. I've talked to a lawyer in Laramie about how the property can be held, and I know what the options are." "Then we'll set it up the way you want it," he said. "I'm not marrying you for your land. I have my own land. I'm marrying you because you're the most remarkable person I have encountered in 29 years of living, and I want to be around you for the rest of my life, and those are my reasons, all of them." She looked at him with something that was not quite the weighing expression but was related to it, as though she was checking his words against something inside herself and finding them accurate. "All right," she said. "All right. Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you. I said I want to. I meant it." He leaned across the space between their horses and kissed her, briefly and warmly, and she kissed him back with the same deliberateness she brought to everything, and Colonel and Duchess ignored the whole business with the sublime disinterest of horses. They rode home in the falling afternoon and Benjamin felt the kind of happiness that does not shout but settles in, deep and sure, like a good post driven into solid ground. The wedding was set for April, which gave them time for the practical arrangements, and also for the natural process of a Wyoming winter to exhaust itself. They used the intervening months well. He rode to the Abbott place 2 or 3 times a week, and she came to his ranch at least once. And they ate together and talked and read and made plans for the 2 properties and for the spring. And he learned her in the way you learn someone you are going to spend a life with, the particular way she held her cup when she was thinking, the way her voice changed when she talked about something she loved, the way she got a small line between her brows when she was frustrated with a problem, and then the way it disappeared when she worked out the solution. She learned him too. She learned that he was quieter in the mornings than at any other time and needed coffee before conversation, that he had a particular whistle he used to call Colonel and another one for Hector, that he made decisions carefully and slowly, but once made he did not second-guess them, that he had a dry humor that appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly, that he was a man who expressed care through doing rather than saying, and that once you understood that you could read him very easily. In February, a difficulty arose that was not unexpected but was unwelcome. The man who had been persistent about buying Etta's land, a cattle broker named Silas Vance, appeared in Laramie with renewed interest and a newer and more aggressive approach. He had heard about the engagement and seemed to view it as an obstacle rather than a reason to abandon his plans. He had a conversation with Benjamin in the street, outside the hardware store that was civil on the surface and not particularly civil underneath, in which he suggested that Benjamin might reconsider encouraging a woman to hold property that could be put to better use by someone with the resources to develop it properly. Benjamin listened to this with the patience of a man who had dealt with all varieties of human foolishness, and then said, with great mildness, "Mrs. Abbott is her own counsel, Mr. Vance. She's been her own counsel for 26 years, and I expect she'll continue to be. And I'd advise you to remember that when someone has said no clearly enough times, hearing it more times does not change it. It just changes what the no costs to the person doing the asking." Vance took his leave. He did not return to trouble either of them again, whether because he had gotten the message or because other ventures occupied him, was not something Benjamin inquired into. Etta, when he told her about it that evening, was characteristically direct about her feelings. "I handled Silas Vance for 2 years before you came along," she said, "but I appreciate that you said what you said without threatening him or making it worse." "He's not worth worse," Benjamin said. "No," she agreed, "he isn't." March came in hard and went out soft the way March often does in Wyoming, arriving with a blizzard that shut everything down for 4 days, and departing with a week of sunshine that turned the world to mud, and the sound of melt water running everywhere. Pete Garza's wrist had healed fully, and he was back to full work on the Abbott Ranch, and he received the news of the upcoming marriage with the expression of a man who had seen it coming since October and had already adjusted his internal landscape accordingly. "You'll take care of her," he said to Benjamin. This was not a question. "We'll take care of each other," Benjamin said, which was the right answer, and Pete nodded and said nothing more, which was also the right response. The wedding was on a Saturday in mid-April, which turned out to be one of those spring days that Wyoming occasionally offers as an apology for its winters, clear and warm with a light wind, and the first wildflowers coming up along the fence lines. Reverend Calder officiated at the church in Laramie with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been waiting for this particular ceremony for some time. Mrs. Thorne cried, which she had promised she would not. Pete Garza stood in the back and looked deeply satisfied. Several neighbors attended, and the whole thing was done with the plain, practical warmth of frontier people, marking something important without the resources or the inclination for excess ceremony. Etta wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a dressmaker's catalog, deep blue wool with white at the collar and cuffs, and she walked into the church with her back straight and her eyes clear, and she looked exactly like herself, which was exactly what Benjamin wanted, not a version of her dressed up for an occasion, but Etta, fully and without apology. He took her hand when Reverend Calder instructed him to, and he held it with the feeling of someone holding something irreplaceable. When he said the words of the vow, he said them directly to her, not to the room, not to the Reverend, but to her face, and she said hers the same way, looking at him steadily with those dark eyes that missed nothing. And when Calder told him he could kiss his bride, he did so with the same economy and warmth that characterized everything between them. Not a performance, but the real thing, and she kissed him back the same way. They rode back to his ranch, which was to say to their ranch, because they had decided together that his house was larger and better situated, and she would move there while keeping her own property operational with Pete managing the day-to-day. Her books came first, 4 separate trips, and then the kitchen things she cared most about, and then the practical items, and finally the lantern, which she hung in the front window of the house, and it was not lost on either of them that the lantern that had brought Benjamin to her gate was now in the house they shared. "It seems right that it should be here," she said, adjusting it in the window. "It does," he agreed. The spring unfolded with the particular generosity of good years. The kitchen garden went in and she expanded it the way she had planned, with root vegetables and herbs and a long row of beans that became, by August, extraordinary. The seedlings from Mrs. Thorne were a success. The cattle on both properties did well. Benjamin's quarter-horse breeding program produced 3 foals that spring, 2 of which were exceptional, and the young stallion he had been considering from Colorado turned out to be available and turned out to be everything he had hoped. They worked well together in the way she had predicted they would, truly as partners, making decisions jointly and dividing the work according to ability and inclination rather than convention. She was better with the cattle than he was, having a patience for their particular kind of obstinacy that he admired enormously. He was better with the horses, having a way of establishing trust with them that was almost uncanny. They were both better with the land than most people, both having the particular quality of sustained attention that made good farmers and ranchers, the ability to notice small things before they became large things. In September, in the kitchen on a Sunday morning while the light came through the windows and Hector lay in a patch of it on the floor, Etta told him that she was expecting a child. She told him simply, directly, watching his face. He sat very still for a moment and then he got up and went to her and held her, and she let him, and against his shoulder she said, "I was not sure how you would feel." "Etta," he said, "I know we hadn't discussed the timing." "Etta," he said again, pulling back enough to see her face, "I am overjoyed, are you? That's what matters most right now." She considered this with her characteristic seriousness, and then her face broke into that real smile, the wide one, the one that changed her face entirely. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I am." He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and she laughed, which was a sound he was still collecting like a man collects beautiful things he hasn't seen before, because it was not a sound she made carelessly. The pregnancy was, by the standards of the era, uncomplicated. She was healthy and practical about it, in the way she was practical about most things. She continued working through the fall, adjusting the tasks to what was sensible, accepting help, without making a performance of either accepting or refusing it. He watched over her with a care that was not smothering, because she had drawn the line clearly on what she wanted, and he respected it. But he felt a new and permanent attentiveness that had settled into him that he suspected would never fully go away. Their son was born in the spring of 1884, in early May when the world was green again, and the wildflowers were back along the fence lines. And the child came into the world on a morning that was clear and bright, and the midwife from Laramie, a capable woman named Mrs. Angel, who had brought half the children in the county into existence, presided with efficient warmth. He was a big, healthy boy with dark hair like his mother and Etta's, same quality of focused attention, looking at the world from the first hours as though he was cataloging it. They named him Thomas James Archer, Thomas for Etta's first husband whose memory she would honor, and James for Benjamin's father who had left him the box of books. It seemed right to both of them, and they decided it together with the same ease they decided most things. Benjamin held his son in the crook of his arm and felt something he could not put a name to, except that it was like all the feelings that mattered gathered in one place at one time. He looked at Etta, who was exhausted and clear-eyed and present in the way she was always present, and he thought that he had come to her gate in October of 1882 to return a lantern, and what he had received in exchange was beyond any fair accounting. "He looks like you," he told her. "He looks like himself," she said, which was also correct. Pete Garza met Thomas James 2 days later and received him with solemn respect, the same serious acknowledgment he gave to everything worth acknowledging. Mrs. Thorne brought food enough for a family of 12 and cried again. Reverend Calder sent a note of congratulation with a Bible verse written in careful script. Thomas grew in the particular way of healthy frontier children, quickly and strongly, and with an early independence that his mother observed with private satisfaction, and his father observed with the rueful recognition of a man watching his own characteristics, appear in miniature and somewhat amplified form. By the time he was walking and talking, he already had opinions about everything, which everyone agreed was not surprising. They settled into the life they were building with the same attention they gave to everything. The properties continued to prosper. Benjamin's horse breeding reputation spread through the territory, and he began receiving inquiries from Colorado and Montana. Etta's cattle operation, with Pete's continued help, ran efficiently and profitably, and her kitchen garden became something people came to see when they visited, which people increasingly did. She continued to read voraciously, ordering books from Mrs. Havorson and from the Chicago bookseller who had supplied Benjamin's Christmas gift, and the shelf in their front room expanded, and then a second shelf was added, and occasionally she read aloud in the evenings, while Benjamin sat across from her, and Hector lay between them, and Thomas eventually fell asleep in whatever position the evening had found him in. And it was in these evenings that Benjamin felt most clearly the shape of what his life was and what it meant. There were difficulties, as there are always difficulties in frontier life. A hard winter in 1885 that tested the cattle and required every resource they had. A season of illness in 1886 that went through Thomas and Benjamin in quick succession, and Etta nursed them both with a competence and tenderness that undid Benjamin completely. A year when the market for horses was soft, and they had to adjust their plans and be creative about the breeding program. None of these things broke them, and the reason none of these things broke them was that they faced them together, with the same honesty and practical cooperation that had characterized everything between them from the beginning. In the spring of 1886, Etta told him she was expecting again, and again he was overjoyed, and again she watched his face for his true response before allowing herself to fully feel her own. The second child arrived in November, a girl this time, and she was small and fierce and loud about her arrival, making her preferences known immediately in a way that Etta observed with an expression that suggested she felt she was meeting someone familiar. They named her Mary Louise Archer, Louise for Etta's mother who had sent the books and believed in reading as survival. Thomas, 2.5 years old, regarded his sister with the profound wariness of a child confronting an unknown quantity, and then, over the course of the first week, transferred to her the absolute and unconditional allegiance that would characterize their relationship for decades. Benjamin observed this with the private wonder of a man who had not grown up with siblings, and found the formation of this bond between his children to be one of the most extraordinary things he had witnessed. Mary Louise, as she grew, turned out to have her father's temperament more than her mother's, or perhaps some combination that produced its own distinct result, quieter than Thomas but quicker to observe, with a quality of stillness that was not passivity but attention, watching everything with large brown eyes that missed nothing. The lantern stayed in the window. It was there through all the seasons, through the winters when the frost formed patterns on the glass around it, and the summers when the evenings were long and warm, and they sat on the porch while the children ran in the yard. It was there in October when the anniversary of that first morning came around each year, which they marked not with ceremony but with a private acknowledgment between them, a look or a word, or sometimes just the awareness of it shared across a room. On the 4th anniversary of Benjamin's arrival at her gate, Etta came out to find him in the barn where he was checking on a new foal, and she stood in the doorway with the morning light behind her and said, "4 years ago today, you came to return a lantern." He looked up from the foal. "I did, and you saw the fence. I did, and you stayed. I did." She was quiet for a moment in the way she was sometimes quiet when she was saying something more carefully than her usual directness required. "I've been thinking about that a great deal," she said. "About the fence, about the lantern, about what happens when things fall down at the right time." "The fence needed to fall," he said. "No," she said. "The fence needed you to see it." She paused. "Most people would have left the lantern on the porch and ridden on." "I'm not most people," he said. "No," she said. "You are not." She came into the barn and stood beside him, and they looked at the foal together, a fine bay colt that was only 2 days old and already had the look of something exceptional. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the ease of 4 years of choosing each other. "What are we calling him?" she asked, nodding at the foal. "I thought Lantern," he said. She turned her head and looked at him with an expression he recognized as the version of her face that she wore when he had surprised her genuinely, which was rare and therefore precious. "Lantern," she repeated. "For the one that brought me to your gate," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and he could feel against his side the small movement that meant she was containing something. And then she said, "All right, Lantern," and she said it directly to the foal, who regarded her with the liquid dark curiosity of very young animals encountering interesting people for the first time. They walked back to the house together through the October morning, and the air was sharp and bright, and the mountains were clear on the horizon, and the fence along the south run of her old property was still standing, maintained now with the regularity of people who understood the value of maintaining things before they fell, and the lantern was in the window of the house they had made together. Thomas was at the kitchen table arguing with his breakfast with the conviction of a 3-year-old who had opinions about eggs. Mary Louise was in her crib making the small focused sounds of a baby who was awake and cataloging the ceiling. Pete Garza was crossing the yard toward the barn with the purposeful gait of a man with work to do, and somewhere down the road the day was beginning for everyone who lived in this part of Wyoming in this particular autumn of 1886. Benjamin sat down at the table and Etta poured coffee and set it in front of him, and their fingers touched on the cup, briefly, the way they touched on things all the time now, with the easy and ongoing language of people who had learned each other completely. Thomas looked up from his eggs. "Papa," he said. "Yes," Benjamin said. "Can I ride today?" "After breakfast," Benjamin said. "If you eat the eggs." Thomas regarded the eggs. Thomas regarded his father. He ate the eggs. Etta sat down across from him with her own coffee and her own breakfast, and opened the book she had been reading the previous evening, a natural history she was particularly absorbed in, and Benjamin drank his coffee and listened to the sounds of the house around him, and thought that he was the luckiest man in Wyoming, which was possibly too modest a geography for the sentiment, but which would do well enough as a start. The year 1887 brought changes to the Wyoming territory that rippled through the ranching and farming communities with the force of things that cannot be controlled, but must be adapted to. A series of banking consolidations in the east affected credit availability in the west, and several ranchers in the Laramie Valley found themselves squeezed. Benjamin and Etta were well enough positioned, their diversified operations and their careful management of debt having given them a stability that some of their neighbors lacked, but they felt the pressures and adjusted accordingly. Etta sold a portion of her cattle that spring, reducing the herd to a size that was more efficient to manage, and used the capital to clear the last of the debt on the original Abbott property. She sat down with Benjamin and the accounts one March evening after the children were in bed, and they worked through the numbers with the focused attention of partners who both understood figures and did not blink from what the figures said. "We're better placed than I thought," he said, looking at the totals. "We're better placed because we haven't overspent on things that couldn't be sustained," she said, which was the kind of thing she said that made him realize again, as he did regularly, how much of their stability was the product of her particular intelligence applied steadily over years. "Do you ever regret not expanding the cattle operation the way you were planning before I came along?" he asked. She looked at him with the mild surprise of someone who has been asked a question they hadn't considered necessary. "No," she said. "I had to scale back that plan regardless. It was a plan I made when I didn't know exactly what I was working with. I know better now." She paused. "Everything I have is better now." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him hold it over the account books, which was a very specific and very Etta Abbott thing. The the romanticism occurring alongside the practical without apology for either. The foal lantern had grown into a spectacular young horse, confirming Benjamin's early assessment and generating the kind of quiet attention from serious horse people that preceded a reputation. He had a quality of intelligence that was unusual, the ability to read a rider's intent and respond with a precision that made experienced horsemen stop what they were doing and simply watch. By the time he was 2 years old, Benjamin had turned down 3 purchase offers that would have been good money, because Lantern was going to be important to the breeding program in ways that could not be replaced. Thomas, at 5, had developed an absolute passion for horses that went beyond the typical childhood enthusiasm and into the genuine connection of someone who had the instinct. Benjamin began teaching him in the careful, measured way he had been taught himself, starting with understanding and trust before anything else, and Thomas applied himself with a seriousness that was recognizably his mother's, and that Benjamin found both touching and mildly terrifying in its intensity. Mary Louise, at 2, had developed a passion for the kitchen garden, and followed Etta around in it with a small bucket and a proprietary attitude about the vegetable beds that everyone found endearing. She also had her father's capacity for extended quiet attention, and could sit in the garden for extended periods examining things with a concentration that was remarkable in a child so small. Life on the plains had its rhythms and its difficulties and its beauties, and the Archer family moved through them with the sustained attention they gave to everything. The fence along the south run of the Abbott property was repaired and maintained and stood as it should, a boundary that was also a declaration. This land is here, and it is cared for, and it will remain. The lantern in the window was lit some evenings when the dark came early, and it cast a warm oval of light that could be seen from the road. And Benjamin, when he came home late from some errand or from the far pastures, would see it from a distance as he rode in, and it would orient him, the way lanterns do, toward where he belonged. In the summer of 1888, Etta's youngest brother James came west from Illinois for the first time, a young man of 22 who had been curious about Wyoming and about his sister's life there for the years she had been there, and who had finally managed to arrange the time and the money for the journey. He arrived on the train in Laramie, and Benjamin met him at the station, recognizing him immediately from Etta's descriptions, tall like her with the same dark eyes and the same quality of taking in a room before commenting on it. James Abbott was quieter than Benjamin had expected and more observant, and he spent the first 2 days of his visit simply watching everything and saying little, which Etta told Benjamin was exactly how her brother had always been. "He's like Mary Louise," she said. "He has to understand a thing before he'll say anything about it." On the 3rd day, James helped Benjamin repair a section of the corral fence that had needed attention for several weeks, and in the course of that work they talked, the way 2 men talk when their hands are occupied, and the talking is therefore less freighted with performance. "She's happy," James said, driving a nail with the competence of someone who had done farm work but was not a farmer. "I know," Benjamin said. "She didn't used to talk about herself being happy," James said. "In the letters. She talked about the work and the land and what she was reading and Thomas and Mary Louise, but not about herself." "She doesn't talk about herself much," Benjamin agreed. "No," James said. "But you can tell, the way she moves around her own kitchen like she owns the air in it. She always moved like she was defending something before." He paused. "She's not defending anymore." Benjamin considered this. He could see what James meant. The careful neutrality she had worn when they first met, the fence she kept in front of her face, was not entirely gone. It was still there when strangers came too close or when people tried to underestimate her. But in their house, in their life, she was open in a way that was different from those first October days, and he had not put words to it before, but James had named it accurately. "She's safe," Benjamin said. "Yeah," James said. "That's it." James stayed 3 weeks and left with an open invitation to return. which he accepted with the same quiet certainty he brought to most things. He and Thomas had developed a rapport that was immediate and complete, James becoming the Uncle Thomas would talk about and compare people to for years. He and Mary Louise had reached an accord based primarily on their shared interest in observation, the two of them sitting in the garden for long periods examining things and occasionally sharing conclusions. He wrote to Etta from Illinois saying it had been the best 3 weeks he could remember and that he hoped to come back in the spring if things allowed, and Etta read this at the kitchen table with Benjamin's coffee going warm beside her and the morning light coming through the window and the lantern dark in it because the sun had risen, and she said, "He's thinking about coming west to stay." "What makes you think so?" Benjamin asked. "I know my brother," she said. "He's been looking for the right place. He's been looking for a long time." James did come west the following spring, not just to visit but with a wagon and his tools, and the particular settled expression of someone who has made a final decision. Benjamin helped him identify a parcel of land to the north of theirs, not too far to be neighborly and not so close as to create complications. And by the summer of 1889, James Abbott had a small house on his own 40 acres and was learning ranching with a seriousness that Benjamin found genuinely impressive. Having Etta's brother nearby was good for all of them. He became a regular presence at their table, and the children adored him, and he was handy with everything that needed doing, the way some people simply are, and he made Etta laugh in the particular way that only family can make you laugh, remembering the same things and the same people from a shared history that Benjamin had not been part of but could watch from the outside and appreciate. Wyoming had been a territory for a long time, and in July of 1890 it was admitted to the Union as a state, and this was celebrated in Laramie with a parade and speeches, and a gathering at the church that turned into a community supper that lasted half the night. What was particularly notable about Wyoming statehood, which Benjamin and Etta discussed at the kitchen table with a seriousness that matched the occasion, was that Wyoming had guaranteed women the right to vote in its territorial constitution, and now that provision would be carried into statehood. Etta had been able to vote in territorial elections since before Thomas Abbott died, which was one of the reasons she had been so resistant to leaving Wyoming when widowed, because she was not going back east to places where that right did not exist. The confirmation of this right in statehood meant something to her that was not just political but personal, the ongoing and legal recognition that she was a full participant in the civilization she had helped to build. Thomas would have been glad about this, she said, not about her late husband but about her son, who was 6 years old and currently under the impression that the celebration was primarily for him. "He'll grow up in a state," Benjamin said. "Mary Louise too." "A state where her vote counts," Etta said. "That's not nothing." "It's not nothing at all," he agreed. Pete Garza had been in Wyoming for 11 years by 1890 and had watched the territory become a state with the complex feelings of a man whose own relationship with the legal order of the American West was not simple. His family had been in this land longer than any Anglo rancher, and the treaties and arrangements that had divided the territory had not always been fair, a fact that Benjamin and Etta were both aware of and had acknowledged between themselves and occasionally with Pete directly. Pete managed the Abbott property with the quiet authority of a man who knew the land as well as anyone, and he was paid fairly and treated as a partner in the operation in the ways that the era allowed, which were not all the ways that would have been right, but were more than many of his contemporaries received. Benjamin had made it a point to put their agreements in writing, which Pete had seemed surprised by and then had understood, because written agreements were at least something to stand on. The summer of 1890 was a good one, warm and wet enough, the kind of summer that makes the plains look like they were always going to be this way, lush and gold green and generous. Benjamin's horse breeding program had by now established a reputation that extended through much of the region, and the name Archer horses was a shorthand in certain circles for a particular quality of working horse, intelligent and willing, and built for the long work of a ranching life. Lantern, who was now 4 years old, was exactly what Benjamin had believed he would be, and the first foals of his line were already showing the qualities that made his father exceptional. Benjamin had kept the best of the mares he had ever bred specifically to Lantern's bloodline, and the resulting offspring were becoming something that people came to see. Thomas, who was 6, was already riding Lantern under close supervision, because Lantern had the patience for it and Thomas had the instinct, and the two of them together were a study in the particular trust that can exist between a horse and a child when both are treated with respect. Etta watched them sometimes from the kitchen window with an expression that was complex with feeling, knowing that her son was going to be a horseman in the deep way his father was, and finding in that knowledge both satisfaction and the particular ache that comes from loving someone you are also letting become fully themselves. Mary Louise at 4 had decided that the garden was her domain, and she was expanding her authority in it incrementally but effectively. She had strong opinions about where things should be planted and had, on several occasions, quietly rearranged things that Etta had put in and then been gently corrected, and then rearranged them when Etta was not looking. Etta found this exasperating and deeply amusing in equal measure and said so to Benjamin, who said, "You know where she gets it," and Etta said, "I do not rearrange things in secret," and Benjamin said, "No, you do it right in front of everyone, which is actually more alarming," and she threw a dishcloth at him. These were the textures of their life, the argument about where the beans should go, the early morning coffee before anyone else was awake, sitting on the porch if the weather allowed, watching the world come light, the evenings with the reading and the fire and the children sleeping late making the house feel full. The work, always the work, the seasonal cycle of a ranching life that was hard and good and demanded everything you had and gave back in most years, a life worth living. In 1891, Etta became expecting again, and told him on a Sunday morning, and he held her in the kitchen with the morning coming through the window and said against her hair, "Third time. We're becoming a reliable operation." She laughed that real laugh and held on to him. "Are you nervous?" he asked. "No," she said. "Should I be?" "You're 35, he said carefully. "Women have children at 35, she said. "Mrs. Angel will manage." Mrs. Angel did manage, though the third child took longer to arrive than the previous 2 and required more of Etta's considerable reserves of stubbornness and endurance. Benjamin spent that November night in the kitchen with Thomas and Mary Louise, ostensibly making supper, but actually just existing in the vicinity of whatever was happening in the room where he could not be, feeling the helplessness of a man who can fix fences and build things and solve most problems he encounters, but cannot do anything about the particular vulnerability of the moment. The child arrived in the early morning hours, a girl, small and dark-haired and silent for one terrifying moment and then very emphatically not silent, and when Mrs. Angel came out to tell him he could come in, Etta was sitting up in bed looking exhausted and absolutely like herself, and in her arms was a small bundle who had her mouth and his nose and an expression of supreme indignation about the whole business of having been born. They named her Eleanor Ruth Archer. Eleanor for the family name Etta had always liked the sound of, Ruth for the biblical woman who had said, "Wherever you go, I will go," which Etta said when she first held her seemed appropriate. Thomas, at 7, received his new sister with the same devoted seriousness he had given Mary Louise. Mary Louise, at 5, looked at Eleanor with the air of someone encountering a new project and then nodded once, as if to say, "All right, I accept this development." James came from his property with food, and with the particular James Abbott expression that he wore when he was moved by something, and was choosing not to say much about it directly, and he held Eleanor carefully and said, "She's very small," which was true, and then said, "She's got good hands," which might or might not have been true, but which they all received as a favorable omen from a man who was learning to read horses. The years that followed were full years, the kind that are difficult to describe in sequence because they are better understood as a texture, a way of living built up over time like the layers of good soil, each season adding to the depth of it. The children grew. The properties continued to sustain them. Benjamin's horses continued to build a reputation. Etta's kitchen garden became genuinely famous among the neighbors, and at the annual harvest gathering, it was understood that Mrs. Archer's contributions would be the centerpiece. Pete Garza remained and continued to be essential, his connection to the Abbott property having deepened over the years into something that was more than employment and more than friendship, and was its own particular kind of belonging, the belonging of someone who had given years of his best work to a place and made it better by being there. He had a house now on the property, properly his own, and he had begun teaching Thomas the particular methods of cattle work that he had learned growing up in Texas. And Thomas absorbed everything with the focused hunger of a child who understood that real knowledge was precious. In 1893, Benjamin rode to Colorado to look at a particular line of mares that a rancher there was selling due to financial difficulty, a result of the broader economic troubles that were moving through the country. He was gone 4 days and came back with 3 mares and a clearer picture of what the economic year ahead was likely to look like. And he and Etta sat down with the accounts again and made adjustments, selling some things and preserving others, and navigated the difficulty with the same practical attention they always brought to hard times. Thomas was 9 that year and rode with Benjamin on that Colorado trip, his first real journey on his own horse rather than alongside someone else's, and he came back with the particular air of a boy who has been somewhere and seen something, and has been treated as someone old enough to matter, which Benjamin had done deliberately, because he remembered what that felt like at 9 and what it had meant. Mary Louise was 8 and had begun corresponding with Mrs. Havorson's lending library on her own behalf, writing careful letters requesting specific books on botany and plant cultivation, which Mrs. Havorson found both remarkable and delightful, and accommodated with great enthusiasm. Etta read these letters before they were sent, not to censor them, but because she found them wonderful. Eleanor at 2 was a person of great opinions and few boundaries, exploring the world with a comprehensive curiosity that required monitoring without suppression, which was an ongoing calibration that Etta managed with the particular expertise of a woman who recognized her own qualities in miniature and had long since made peace with them. The lantern in the window was there for all of it. Benjamin had repaired the casing once when it was damaged in a winter storm, replacing the corroded brass fitting with new work he did himself at the workbench in the barn, and he had hung it back in the window, and Etta had stood beside him while he did, and neither of them said anything about it being 11 years since it had come to her gate in his hands. They did not need to say it. It was simply there between them, in the way of all the things that had happened between 2 people who had shared a life and made it good, layer by layer, season by season, with work and honesty and the ongoing daily choice to turn toward each other rather than away. On an October morning in 1893, exactly 11 years since the morning he had first ridden up to her gate with the lantern on his saddle horn, Benjamin went out early to check on a foal that had been born the night before, one of Lantern's, and when he came back Etta was standing at the kitchen window with her coffee looking out at the yard, and the morning light was the same October light it always was, pale and clear and particular. He came in behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back into him, and through the window they could see the yard and the fence, and beyond it the plains stretching toward the mountains and the sky going brilliant blue above it all. "Good morning," he said against her hair. "Good morning," she said. "Foal's well," he said. "Up and nursing." "Good," she said. They stood there for a moment looking out at the world they had made and the world that was larger than them and contained them both, and Etta set her coffee on the windowsill next to the lantern, and the lantern was there between the cup and the glass of the window, warm brass in the morning light, not lit now because the sun was up but present the way some things are always present. 11 years, she said. 11 years, he agreed. You came to return a lantern, she said, and rebuilt the fence. And stayed, he said. And stayed, she agreed. And her voice on those two words had in it everything that words cannot usually hold. All the seasons and all the work and all the evenings by the fire and all the mornings like this one. The children sleeping above their heads and the horses in the barn and the plains stretching out to the mountains in the Wyoming light. She turned in his arms and looked at him the way she had looked at him since the beginning, with those dark eyes that missed nothing. And he looked back at her with the accumulated clarity of 11 years of knowing her, of being known by her, and it was the same feeling it had always been, only more. The way water is always the same water, and always different depending on the season and the light and the depth of the riverbed it runs through. I love you, he said. He had said it thousands of times in 11 years, and it still had the weight of the first time, which he thought was the surest sign he knew of having married the right person. I love you, she said, and it was the same. He kissed her in the kitchen with the October light coming through the window and the lantern on the sill, and upstairs the sounds of children beginning to wake. Thomas first, and then the girls. The sounds of mourning in a house that was full of people who were there because of a borrowed lantern and a fallen fence, and a man who could not ride past something that needed doing. The children came downstairs in stages, Thomas first with his habitual morning purposefulness, already thinking about the foal and the horses and the day's work. Mary Louise next with a book she had been reading before she slept, and had apparently continued reading on her way down the stairs. Eleanor last in a state of magnificent sleepiness, still trailing the blanket she had apparently brought with her from her bed. Benjamin made coffee, and Etta made breakfast, and Thomas ate fast, and was out the door to the barn. Mary Louise ate slowly and read, and answered questions about the book when her father asked them. Eleanor ate with the focused determination of someone engaging with important work. Pete crossed the yard toward the barn, and nodded through the window when he saw Benjamin looking out. James would come over for supper on Saturday, as he did most Saturdays now, and the table would be crowded and loud and full of the particular warmth of a family that had grown around itself, the way good things grow, without forcing it. The fence along the south run of the Abbott property stood straight and maintained, the wood weathered now from its original pale newness to the darker gray of good old timber, the same fence that Benjamin had helped rebuild on an October morning 11 years ago, when he had come to return a lantern, and had seen a woman fighting the frozen ground with a hammer, and had thought, without yet knowing why, that this was a place he needed to be. He had been right. He was still here. She was still here. The lantern was in the window and the fence was standing, and the children were growing into people who would go out into the world and make it better, and the horses were in the barn, and the cattle were in the pasture, and the mountains were blue on the horizon, and Wyoming was a state now, and the sky was October blue and clear. Benjamin Archer stood in the kitchen of the house he had helped to fill with living, and looked at Etta Abbott Archer, who was scrambling eggs and saying something over her shoulder to Mary Louise about the book. And he thought that a man who began his adult life believing that love was a thing that happened to other people more easily than it happened to him, had been comprehensively and thoroughly corrected in that belief, and that he was grateful every day for the correction. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set hers beside her on the stove, and she took it without looking up and said thank you in the way she said things she meant, simply and directly, and he sat down at the table with his own coffee and his daughter in the morning, and the lantern was in the window, and everything was as it should be, and everything was good.